Education Center. You guys are the best. So thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, all of you, for the hard work. I am grateful to all of you for tuning into this series. And today it's about lead. It's a new standard in the sense that we've always had protections for lead out there, but they spruced it up and they brought a ton of new, I have to say, there's so much information and there's a lot of nuance to this regulation. So I just want to, my goal is always, when you come to these webinars, the goal is to give you practical things that you can use. What can you take back to work so that, hey, it means something? This particular topic is so full with information that I find that if you're going to be doing the work of putting together a compliance written program, if you're a consultant, if you're an industrial hygienist, the first thing you got to do is print out and read the two standards. So there's two standards. There's one for general industry, and then there's one for construction. And so 1 hour, it's going to go really fast. I'm just going to highlight some of the key issues and go over some of the actual questions that we had. But truly, the key is always, let me have some tools. Just give me, kind of like action points, and let us work towards compliance, especially when regulations get so wordy and so specific like this one. So this one's a lengthy one. I mean, it's probably more than 100 pages if you print out just the general industry standard with the appendices. So there's appendix A through D just for general industry. And for the actual construction standard, there's no appendices, and it's actually a little bit shorter. Nevertheless, they're different and they're similar. So I really highly advise that you print out both, even if you are only focused on construction or only focused on general industry, because it'll give you a good idea as to what they are asking. And it'll also allow you to kind of scratch your head a little bit more as to their requirements. But let's get to it. So simply, I just want to talk to you a little bit about identifying and explaining the new permissible exposure limits. And for those of you that are new to safety or have started taking this monthly webinars because you've been newly assigned to safety and it's a task that got thrown to you, there are some terms that you may not be familiar with. PEL means permissible exposure limit, and it basically means the limit at which you cannot legally go beyond and expose your workers to, right? So PEL and action levels. And an action level is when you hit something or a number below the PEL where OSHA says, hey, this starts being an issue. Let's do some things here to protect the worker. Let's measure this up. Let's see what's up. So in PELs and action levels are included in regulations like noise, silica, lead, etc. So the second objective is to review some of these requirements so that you can start that interim protection for workers engaged in these presumed significant lead work activities, but also those trigger tasks in construction. So they're kind of termed differently, and that's why I highly advise that you do read the standards. I know it's like so wordy and sometimes it makes you fall asleep, right? Because they're lengthy. But they really do a lot towards understanding why, or even the nuances of things that you need to put in place in your written compliance program. So the next thing is recognizing some of those 2026 implementation deadlines. All right, let's get started. I appreciate your time, like I said, and thank you, Veronica, for explaining a lot of the good stuff regarding that survey, etc., and their continuing education hours. So here's some of the intro to this OSHA occupational lead exposure. So on February 15, 2024, the Standards Board voted to approve proposed amendments to OSHA's lead standards. Mind you, it's been over a decade that OSHA has been wanting to get these changes. And so you have the actual regulations for construction, we're always in the thousands, so 1532.1 for the construction industry, and always in the 5,000s you're going to find general industry, so 5198 for general industry. And then the approved amendments, there's an actual link to the approved amendments that you can read and find out what this is all about. But the key thing here is that all of this is now being enforced. What does that mean? January 1st, 2025, OSHA sees work being done, especially if it's work that takes place out in the fields coming up summer, where the emphasis program for heat illness will bring your Cal OSHA inspectors to the site, then you are going to see that they will ask for these things. It's like in general industry. If they get to you for some other reason, like a random inspection because you're a high hazard type of industry, you may see that they will ask for your indoor heat illness prevention program. Why? Because it's a regulation that started July 2024. And because it started last summer, this year, during summer, they're going to be enforcing that new regulation for indoor places of employment. So same principle here. They go out there because of an issue of heat illness, because mind you, there is a heat illness emphasis program especially for outdoor places of employment. And they're going to ask for your lead compliance programs, your written programs per this new regulation. So make sure you're up to date, because you did have some time to get this worked up through 2024, because since it was February when they started showing all of the approved amendments, and then in April 8th, 2024, they said, okay, this is already approved and ready to go. We will start enforcing this January 1st, 2025. So basically, the biggest change for this particular standard is the permissible exposure limit. There's a huge reduction from 50 micrograms per cubic meter to 10 micrograms per cubic meter, calculated in an 8-hour TW8, which is the time-weighted average. And what that means is that you take the exposure of the worker, depending on the activities that this worker is doing, and you're going to measure the exposure during task A, task B, task C. Let's say this worker does 3 different tasks during his workday. So you're going to take those 3 different tasks and you're going to measure the exposure, average out in his or her 8-hour shift, and that's what constitutes the actual exposure. So it's a formula, but then you will see, I will talk a little bit about it. Now there's a requirement to also take into account other contaminants that they are being exposed to that have the same health effects as lead. For example, we have mercury and manganese and some of the solvents in some of the materials, or things in paint that add to the health effects, to the negative health effects in exposed workers. So now the regulation is requiring that you consider additive effects to this time-weighted average. So, and we'll talk a little bit about it. There's a formula for that, and I'll give you the actual regulation. I think it's 5155, but I'll make sure I get it up on your screen. So this is not new. We know that federal OSHA has been trying to change the standard because the PEL that we had before January 2025, 50 micrograms per cubic meter, was based on old information, old data, 40 years ago, basically, and it hadn't been changed. And federal government and the EPA had been making many changes because the new evidence, the new research showed that there's really no safe level of lead exposure. And they started seeing this because the California Department of Public Health around 2012 started asking that pregnant women be removed from working or being exposed to lead whenever they hit that blood level of 10 deciliters of micrograms per deciliter. So they decided that it's going to start harming the pregnant woman and her unborn child. And then for children, and they gave reference levels, right? And a reference level is nothing but something that they've been receiving information on, but that doesn't mean that it's a safe level. It's a reference level. And for children, a blood level of 5 micrograms per deciliter was considered to be a reference level where it was, and then determined that there's no safe lead level for children. So because of all this new information that the California Department of Public Health had, etc., they continued to work towards changing it. Mind you, in the beginning, we had a permissible exposure level from 200 micrograms, and it got reduced to 50, and now we are at 10 starting January 2025. So it's a huge, huge change. And that is why it took so long for this regulation to actually come into place and be approved. It's no wonder, right? It's just difficult to get to from point A to point B when you reduce the actual permissible exposure limit so much. So the 8-hour time weighted average is the employee's full shift exposure to urban lead expressed as an 8-hour average exposure, just for you guys to have more information. Now, like I said, the background, that the information we had for this regulation before was very old. Evidence shows that there's many harmful health effects that can occur at very, very low levels of exposure. Existing regulations established a PEL of 50 micrograms that is not enough to protect workers. That's the principle behind all of these. So it was reduced from 50 to 10 in an 8-hour time weighted average. And the action level, which triggers protective measures, is lowered from 30 micrograms per cubic meter to 2 micrograms per cubic meter, which is a very significant reduction as well. So the new PEL and AL, and now we know that means permissible exposure limit and action limit, is more restrictive, but it also requires that you ensure that your actual permissible exposure limit takes into account the additive health effects according to Title 8, California Code of Regulations 5155. And when you look at it, it's a regulation where they provide you with a formula where you have to take into account the actual PEL, right? And the exposure at which you have the worker. And then you add those two substances. And even though for each substance, you may be well under the permissible exposure limit, when you add it up with the formula, you may be at 1.2 or 1.1, which would be right over the limit. And this is because many of the components of chemicals out there, such as paint and construction materials and siding and you name it, have a lot of not just lead, but hexavalent chromium and manganese and benzene and toluene. So you have to take into account the negative health effects of these substances, which also target organs that the same thing with lead, right? Either your kidneys, huge deal there, or the central nervous system. And that is the reason behind this new requirement about the additive health effects, right? And so the PEL has an 80% reduction, which is really big, and an action level drops 93%. So why is it that lead is toxic? So the regulation has these new levels, and the truth is the California Department of Public Health is working towards more research, more information to really and truly find out safe levels of lead exposure. So it's a heavy metal and it causes serious health effects. It enters the body through what? When we inhale it as we work with it, or when we ingest it. And unfortunately, ingestion occurs many times because of the lack of hygiene practices, right? Workers may be smoking, they may be smokers, and as they are chipping paint, and they grab or smoke a cigarette or whatever, and that residue on the hands gets onto whatever they are bringing to their mouth, and now they're ingesting or putting it on their skin, right? Just by grabbing and touching the actual material they're working with and putting it on their skin if they don't have protective clothing, or on their mouths if there is no good hygiene practices that prohibit workers to either smoke, eat, or apply cosmetics while they are doing type of work that exposes them to lead. Lead accumulates in the body over time, and it does hurt the nervous system, the kidneys, the blood forming organs, the reproductive system. And initially lead poisoning, because of the actual symptoms, may be difficult to diagnose. So we're talking about things such as high blood pressure. I mean, how many people are hypertense, right? How many of our workers? So they're not going to attribute this kinds of symptoms to overexposure to lead. And so, metallic taste in the mouth, loss of appetite, nausea, constipation, abdominal pain, mood disorders. I mean, come on, I have mood disorders, me, and that has nothing to do with lead, right? But truly, guys, it just adds to the seriousness of the problem because it affects the workers' health in a way that they may not be able to peg it and not be inclined to go to the doctor or the industrial clinic because of lead exposure. So let's talk a little bit about what workers and which workers may be having these symptoms and maybe in some of these industries and should raise like a red flag and say, I need to look into the lead standard for construction or general industry. And remember, the reason why I say read both, study both, is because it's not so much the, and just don't catch me out here, but it's not so much the type of industry you're in, although it has something to do, big to do, but it's also the activity the worker is doing. A lot of the times, workers in your manufacturing plant find themselves doing manual demolition, which is a construction task, or they are doing remodeling in a part of the building that is old and they're exposed to lead without knowing. So these are the issues that you need to watch out for, because things such as renovating, demolition of structures with lead paint. And when we say demolition, don't just imagine the big wrecking ball, right? We're talking about manually scraping and resurfacing something and using all those scrapers because you gotta take that old paint out and make a surface smooth. Welding, cutting, or burning on lead painted surfaces. And then some of us believe or have the notion that there's no more lead in paint. There's no lead-based paint anymore. It's illegal, etc. But the truth is, if we take a look at whether or not there's any lead present in some of this construction material, especially with paint, there is. And so we really need to be aware of those safety data sheets and what is the actual lead content, and start asking questions and finding out what are the materials this worker is going to be interacting with, or scraping or sanding or doing manual demolition with, so that we start looking into, is there any data or information out there that can help me find out what is the actual exposure. But remember, when we look at regulations and when we look at whether or not we have to do something about it, it has to do with the scope. Who does it apply to? And the key here is that it says to any lead exposure, right? And so I'm going to walk you through some of these issues, but here, hear me out in regards to the industries with exposure. So electrical work with lead sheathed cables. In manufacturing, you have metal product fabrication, electronics production, glass and ceramic manufacturing with lead glazes, plastic manufacturing with lead stabilizer, lead crystal production, lead acid battery manufacturing. And you're going to find, very interestingly, that because of the lead acid battery manufacturing industry current processes, it's difficult to get them to under the current approved PEL. So there's some different deadlines for them as they work towards lowering those level of exposure. Battery recycling operations as well, grid casting, paste mixing and application, assembly and finishing. It has to do with battery production, all of that. Demolition, wrecking, demolition of structures with lead materials, torch cutting of paint and steel. And then I think of your wildfire sites with all of that lead in the soil all around you. So I'll talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of, if you're going to hire a consulting firm to do this lead compliance written programs for you, don't just rely heavily on them keeping you compliant. After all, it is your job to read those compliance programs and find out whether or not you're doing it right. But with soil especially, you gotta test the soil to find out, because in those sites with wildfires, you will have way higher concentrations of lead in the areas surrounding those sites. And mind you, that's why during the cleanup, there was 2 stages with the wildfire cleanup. And they were, it was supposed to be where homeowners wouldn't go back to it unless it was rendered a safe site. Nevertheless, if you're called, let's say, to build or work there, you really need to know whether or not, because this is safe for the homeowners, but what about if you are going to start doing construction activities or now digging or digging a trench, for example, in those sites? You need to know the lead content for the soil that you're going to be working with. So it has to be tested. There's no other way around it, because working with soil is not one of those triggered tasks included in the regulation. So, and I'll show you what the trigger tasks are. They are well explained and specified in the construction industry regulation. So, torch cutting of painted steel is also part of the exposure type of industry. Concrete breaking with lead painted surfaces. In the recycling industry, the scrap metal processing, electronic waste recycling, lead cable stripping, battery breaking. In the automotive industry, you have radiator repair and soldering, auto body repair of lead painted vehicles, brake repair for historical vehicles, maintenance, soldering, plumbing, installing of lead-containing structures. Firearm ranges are a huge deal. So police departments, cities, or even uh, recreative firearm ranges have these issues where now the exposure to lead calls the issue of where and how you have your ventilation systems, and how are you doing your bullet trap cleaning, and are you allowing for dry sweeping, which is completely a big no-no with this new regulation, because anything that will disturb the dust or make the dust come up, it is not allowed. So now you're required to look into HEPA vacuums and etc. Painting lead abatement, removal of lead paint, scraping, sanding, blasting, encapsulation of lead paint, cleanup of lead dust. So lots of different industries and tasks that should bring that red flag. Are we doing this? Are we planning to do demo? Are we planning to renovate? Are we, mind you, and some of you may be saying, I am not going to do this, but that's why I'm going to bring a contractor on site to do it for me. So if you're going to outsource any of these jobs, guess what you're going to require of them before they step foot on your facility? That they provide you with proof of training for each of the workers that will be on your site, and of course your IIPP. You should have a list of documents that you should be requiring whenever you outsource work and somebody else's employees are going to be on your site. And then you should also require that written compliance program from these subcontractors or anybody that's gonna be doing lead abatement or working with or disturbing any of these structures doing activities as the ones that we explained before. Okay, so we talked about this. Anytime you hit this action level, it triggers, and this is what's important. And as you receive copy of the slides, make a little circle on it. And exposure monitoring. What does that mean? Well, it's good. Exposure monitoring allows you to actually, once you say, we're going to be working with lead, and I'm not sure how much lead this soil has, and I don't know how much. Mind you, working with soil is not included in the trigger tasks. Nevertheless, if you want to be safe and you don't have any data to know, and this is most likely what is happening with those doing wildfire cleanup response, they are providing the employees with all of the provisions of the regulation, which is training, medical surveillance for respiratory purposes, and cleaning facilities, showers on site if the tasks are really exposing them way above the actual PEL and above 50 micrograms per cubic meter. So other protective measures, but just the action level triggers the implementation of the exposure monitoring, which means taking measurements to see really how much lead is in the materials you're working with. Training, it triggers training. You have to talk to the employees. There's an actual list of things that you will have to discuss with them, such as the negative health effects of lead, right? The training for if you're going to have medical surveillance, right? What does that mean? And that you're going to be providing them with the results of that medical surveillance and the blood lead testing and how often, and that you have 5 days to give them the results. And you're going to give them an actual explanation of what you're doing for them. And then you're going to also have a provision for protective clothing so that they do not take the regular street clothes and work with them and get all that lead dust on their clothes and take it back home. Because like I said, when we started, there is no safe level for lead exposure for children under 5, right? So we have to, actually it's not under 5. I'm confusing it with the actual reference level that I told you before, but there is no safe level of lead exposure for children. Let's leave it at that. And so significant reduction from previous standards. So there's a lot of different current scientific data that backs up this new PEL and action level. So let's talk about, so now let's start dividing it. Let's talk about construction industry only. It applies to all construction work where employees may be exposed to lead. You see that? It's very simple. It tells you if you're going to do construction work and there's going to be exposure to lead, you're it. So now you got to read on the rest of the standard. That line just made it to where you have to read on. 2, covers demolition, removal, new construction, renovation, installation, cleanup, and maintenance activities. The definitions include 3 levels of triggered tasks that determine exposure risk levels. Mind you, the trigger tasks have always been there, but now there's a little bit more specificity to it. And also because of the action level triggering all of these protective measures in place, you are looking into, okay, what happens if I'm doing level 1 trigger task? What happens if I'm doing level 2? What happens if I'm doing level 3? These trigger tasks are not included in the general industry standard. There's something different called presumed containing lead activities. I will read the term to you later, but it's that those are some of the difference, construction versus general industry. So level 1 trigger task, let's give you an example. So as you can see in this picture, this guy is doing level 1 demo when scraping old paint that contains lead. So this manual demolition, manual scraping, and heat gun applications are considered level 1 trigger tasks. For those of you that are thinking, why heat gun applications? That's because the heat melts certain materials and the lead is actually now in a form of fume. So now it's airborne and it's inhaled. So these types of activities will expose the worker to above the PEL, but nothing more than 10 times the PEL. So those are level 1 trigger tasks. And then you have to start thinking about appropriate respiratory protection. For these level 1 trigger tasks, the standard talks about N100s, nothing below that, which gives the worker a protection similar to a half mask elastomeric respirator. Appropriate PPE and equipment, change area. So see, this is the thing. Now, if you're doing these level 1 trigger tasks, you haven't done your exposure monitoring, right? But you're now required to have change areas. This is why, because you don't want their street clothes to be contaminated and take it home. And then mom shakes all of this dust and now it's on the surfaces of your home and the baby crib, etc. Eating facilities or eating areas, so you cannot enter those areas if you've been working with lead unless you have done what? Removed your protective clothing and showered. And mind you, for level 1 trigger task, you do not need to shower. Showers are required for level 3 trigger tasks, but here the requirement is that you wash your face and you wash your hands with specific cleansing compounds. And the regulation talks about cleansing compounds. It doesn't tell you exactly what, but if you even Amazon it out, it's not even Googling it out, but if you Amazon it out, you'll find out that there's specific soaps for lead removal. So you're supposed to give them a chance to wash their face, wash their hands, and they can go to this area where they can eat lunch. There's also a requirement under level 1 trigger tasks for what? Regulated areas. What does that mean? This is a good administrative control. Administrative controls have to do with the way you do a task. And I don't know if you've ever seen, but hospitals, when they don't want people to enter a certain area, they will put authorized personnel only. And it's just an office, right? But because it's their billing office and they don't want anyone coming into, they will say personnel, authorized personnel only, and then they have a lock or whatever. Same principle here, because it's a field, it's a construction type of setup. They want to restrict access. And so what they put is, I wanted to set regulated areas where there's an actual sign and there's specificity as to the writing on that sign, what it needs to say. Medical surveillance is required and training as required. And of course, because you're putting them on a respirator, an N100, it has to be NIOSH tested. It has to have the NIOSH seal. It can't be a paper mask. It looks like one of those paper masks, but remember, a paper mask is something that you just buy at the 99-cent store without anything on it. No NIOSH sign on it, nothing. It's a paper mask. It's not a respirator. But then you get into the N95s and K95s. And your K95s, they're not N95s. They're not tested here in the United States by an accredited laboratory. You cannot use them. And then N95s are not as protective. So now the next level of protection, which is very similar to what a half-face elastomeric piece would give you. It's an N100, P100, R100. And those are the types of respirators that you saw a lot with the wildfire responders, that they were using that, or depending on the task they were doing the half piece, or just like you see on this picture, the full face. Just with a full face, a lot of the times, and you're gonna say, so if he's doing manual demo, why is he all suited up in with full face respirator? It has to do with what else is he doing? What of these? How many of these tasks, right? Because you're going to make a determination for the PPE that they need. Because a full phase respirator is most likely needed whenever you do level 2 trigger tasks, right? Such as spray painting with lead paint, manual sanding, power tool cleaning, grinding, sanding with dust collection systems, like in the picture. You are required to think of this group of what I just read as level 2 trigger tasks. And so you have to do all of the protections in level 1, like I said, plus, you have to make sure that you do not hit a PL once you do your exposure determination, that you are not above 10 times the PEL. I mean, that you are above the 10 times or the range within 10 times the PEL, but no greater than 50 times the PEL. That's what level 2 trigger tasks are. Mind you, if you are sanding or grinding and then you with a collection system, and then you determine after you do your exposure monitoring that you determine that the actual PEL fell under 10 times, then you can classify that as a level 1 and go under those actual protections. Mind you, for you to classify something at a lower level, you need to provide with documentation on what you did to come to that conclusion. And another thing that is a nuance of the regulation as well is that you are required to have an accredited laboratory that is really sharp and up to date regarding this lead standards, because now the accuracy of this testing is also added to the standard. So now it's a 95% accuracy in the testing you're doing, and the equipment needed for this type of accuracy is very expensive. So we don't know how much of this is available now to you, but that is the employer responsibility to take a look at whether or not you are sending these samples. And mind you, you're not the one doing it, it's your industrial hygienist, but maybe you are the industrial hygienist on this call saying, oh yeah, you're right. Oh, there is a requirement to do that. So now I need to take a look at which labs we're going to use to actually do the exposure monitoring. Wow, am I talking fast? I'm like a parrot, but it's just so much to this regulation, and we only have an hour. We really need to design a full course for this one. More stringent respiratory protection appropriate. So maybe you will see there the full phase respirators. The employer may provide less stringent respiratory protection only if they establish through testing that exposure levels are below 100 micrograms per cubic meter. So this is straight from the regulation, so they allow you to do that. And of course, these pictures are pictures that either I take or I find, and they have nothing to do, for most of the pictures I have are from the OSHA website, and you can see some of them are very old. So it doesn't necessarily reflect what you need to do. It reflects an example of what I am discussing. So level 3 trigger tasks. So we have rivet bustings, which is what this worker over here is doing in excess of 50 times the permissible exposure limit. So what are the tasks that are listed, very specific in the construction standard? Using lead-containing mortar or lead burning, where lead-containing coatings or paint are present, and you're doing rivet busting, power tool cleaning, grinding, or sanding without dust collection systems, cleanup activities where dry expendable abrasives are used. So cleanup activities and all of those wildfire responders are having to go really into excessive protections just to prevent, because this is what the standard is saying: protect them before you expose them, do your exposure monitoring as they are working, right? Because you already know that the materials they're working with have lead, and then you can adjust your protections according to what you find out through exposure monitoring. All right, so abrasive blasting, welding, torch cutting, torch burning. Okay, we move on to medical surveillance. Mind you, a lot of the issues with medical surveillance and blood testing is similar in both the standards. There's some nuances and changes that you have to be very sharp about, and there's a lot of keeping tabs, okay? So medical surveillance. So it's required when an employee is exposed to lead at or above the action level. So now you have to make sure that you keep an eye on them. At the action level, as an interim protection for employees performing trigger tasks, I told you that's part of what you're now required to do once you know that the material they're going to be disturbing contains lead. And it's trigger task number 1. We're doing manual demolition. You're doing what? You are giving the medical surveillance. You are actually ensuring that you're going to do blood lead testing, right? Even before the assignment to work with potential lead exposure, and testing prior to performing triggered tasks, with some exceptions, of course. There are some of the nuances there. The blood level testing needs to be ongoing as follows. Every 2 months for the 6 months, then every 6 months for regular exposure, and every 2 months for 6 months after task changes that increase the exposure. Every 2 months for employees with blood lead levels of 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. Wow. So every 2 months for employees with blood lead levels that show 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. And then you do 2 consecutive tests 30 days apart. See, 30 days apart. So the regulation throws many of these requirements 30 days apart below 10 decibels of deciliter. For example, for the exposure monitoring, and it's impossible for me to put so much detail into these presentations and the slides. But for example, for the exposure monitoring, there's this frequency, right? Starts depending on what you're working with, and your first results is either once a year, twice a year, or quarterly. And then you get to adjust that frequency depending on your last 2 tests done 7 days apart. And in this case, for the blood level testing, is every 2 months for employees with blood levels 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter until 2 consecutive tests are 30 days apart, or they test below 10 micrograms per deciliter. And monthly for employees with blood lead levels above 20 micrograms per deciliter. Monthly for employees during medical removal periods, because the reason you remove them is because they have too much blood in their too much lead in their blood. And then monthly for employees performing level 3 trigger tasks. So definitions in a standard always help you to go back and reference them. So as you read the standard and what the standard requires, if you find a term that you don't know what they really mean, go back to the definitions, and it really does help. Medical examinations are required when an employee's blood level reaches 20 micrograms per deciliter, and they're required annually until the blood level drops below 20 micrograms per deciliter. They're required prior to assignment, and required when employees report symptoms. And it says with exceptions, because if you have some objective data, and this is where it starts getting into the gray area. If you have objective data, meaning in your industry or previously you've done testing for some of the activities or materials you're working with, and you have that information, and it's pretty recent. I believe the regulation also says that it's been done within the last 12 months. Testing that you perform within the last 12 months, you can rely on that, and then you wouldn't have to include these workers for medical examination, as long as they're doing the exact same thing, right? So you have objective data, and the activities of those workers are within those same limits. There's nothing different to the tasks. And is required for employees removed from exposure or unlimited duty, right? The medical, yes.
Sorry, we do have a question. There's a question from Susan asking if the employee can refuse testing.
No. Yes, absolutely. No one can force them to have a test done. So once this happens, you have to be ready for this, because it may happen. You have to tell them prior to starting the job, this is what the job entails. This is what's going to happen to you. So why would you assign a worker that is not willing to go through with the job description, basically? So if you didn't advise them of what the job entails, then, because this is not new, testing them for blood level limits is not something new. So maybe let's go back and say, how are we onboarding? What are our hiring processes? Are we not informing people of what the job entails? Because that's maybe the reason why they're having that issue of, oh, no, I don't want you to do this. So that, yeah, of course, you cannot force them, but you also can't have people that do not know what the job entails. So do not assign people to jobs where they're not willing to go through all of these requirements. Hopefully that helped. It's not always 100% bulletproof answer, but it does give you some guidance, or so I hope. And you can make more comments or ask again. The blood level limits, the new medical removal level is at 20 micrograms per deciliter, where previously we had it at 50 or 60, depending on what they were doing. And returning to work level now is 15 micrograms per deciliter, where previously it was 40 micrograms as well. So we see that reduction, and the focus is preventing chronic low-level exposure. We want to make sure that these people can continue on our workforce. They don't lose any of their seniority and benefits, but we also don't want to keep exposing them to lead. So the medical removal threshold lowered 30 decibels effective immediately and 20 decibels 1 year after implementation. So take a look at those deadlines as well. Now we move on to the general industry scope. Goodness gracious. So I kind of went through the highlights of the construction industry. And like I said, so little time. We're about to just finish this presentation and we barely hit the surface, right? So the general industry also starts with a scope. Where does this apply? The standard applies to occupational exposure to lead with the following exception. So same, kind of similar to construction, where they say, anytime they're going to be exposed to lead, this applies, right? It doesn't apply for the construction industry. Why? Because they have their own standards. You have to follow that. If your general industry worker is doing construction activities, look at the construction industry standard. It doesn't apply to agricultural operations either. But here are the main requirements: that you follow the PEL, which is same as the construction, and that you follow that action level, which is same as the construction standard. And then it gets into exposure monitoring. You have to do an initial determination of their exposure, and then you have to do this regular monitoring based on the level. So above 50 micrograms, you got to do quarterly monitoring. Between 30 to 50, every 6 months. And when the action level to 30 decibels per micrograms per cubic meter, the monitoring every 12 months. So it's a different kind of frequency, and it's very specific now with the new standard. There's also a requirement to tell the employee within 5 days of the results, right, of how much lead they're being exposed to. So here is a new term. This is not for the construction industry. This is defined within the actual lead exposure for general industry. They call it the presumed significant lead work. So it's kind of like the equivalent, if you will, to the trigger tasks, but in general industry. And there are special provisions for the PSLW. So altering or disturbing material that is known to contain lead at a concentration equal or greater than 0.5% by weight as a result of material testing, or as content listed in a safety data sheet or similar specification sheet. So you also rely on your SDSs to find out what is the content or concentration of lead in that type of material, and be reasonably anticipated to contain lead at a concentration equal or greater than 0.5 by weight. Such materials include, but are not limited to, scrap, lead, lead solder, lead bullet fragments and dust, lead sheeting, lead cable housing, and lead billets. Torch cutting any scrap metal does not constitute PSLW when the total combined duration of lead exposure resulting in disturbing and torch cutting less than 8 hours in a 30-day period. So that's very specific in the standard. And then I found a handout actually that was really nice, because anytime you're doing a task that exposes workers to lead, you will find different resources. And I like this one for torch cutting. So it says, is there a problem? So you can use this for your presentations, for your training. Blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. So listen to how low that is. Are considered to be harmful to adults. Immediately notify your employer if you develop signs or symptoms. How are they going to notify you if they don't know what the symptoms are? It's all part of training, right? Associated with lead poisoning, or if you need medical advice concerning the effects of current or past exposure to lead, or your ability to have a healthy child. Now, how do you prevent it? The heat generated, so it explains, right, is high enough to melt lead on the surface of the metal. The small lead particles, the fumes, and those are true fumes. People call fumes to everything and anything when it's a gas or a vapor. But for lead, those are fumes. And once it's at lead fume, the particles in those fumes are so small, they're going to reach the small areas of the lungs, the alveoli, and that's how the lead gets into the blood system, right, of a human being. And that's how it gets deposited into your bloodstream and other organs. And not just that, not just inhalation. We talked about ingestion or skin absorption. Largest organ on your body is your skin, right? So you're absorbing all of that. The small lead particles, blah, 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 creating the potential for severe lead poisoning. These lead particles may also stick to a worker's skin and clothing and can also contaminate food, cigarettes, the worker's car, home, family, etc. This is a good handout that I found just for torch cutting that I can put in the chat at the end. Now, the general industry also talks about CCAL. So these are kind of like definitions that they're using to put everything into what group of requirements will these terms bring up to the table. For CCAL is a separate engineering control airborne limit for selected processes. And this came about just because in general industry, you have the lead acid battery manufacturing industry and the lead acid battery recycling. And it's been historically really hard for this type of places of employment to bring the lead exposure to below this PELs. So that's the table was created to help them kind of spread out the implementation dates to continue their efforts and to look into the compliance. So lead acid battery manufacturing, it tells you what are they allowed to expose the workers to and by when. So if you notice here, it will extend, all of those deadlines extend all the way to January, lowering the exposure limit as the years go by. All right, I know I'm going a mile a minute, but as you can see, it's really a lot of information. There's, like I said, there's more than 100 pages, 140 pages probably that you have to review. There's a good tool for the lead battery manufacturing industry on the OSHA website. So it kind of allows you to just click here and there and take a look at hazards and abatement of those hazards. So a very good tool to look into. Just Google it, go to the OSHA website, and then just said lead battery manufacturing e-tool. Respiratory protection for these types of presumed activities. Let me just go to that. And remember, presumed significant lead work is any of these, right? Altering or disturbing material that is known to contain more than 0.5% by weight, or materials that are by weight. Such materials include scrap, lead, lead solder, lead bullet fragments and dust, lead sheathing, lead cable housing, and lead billets. All right. So when we talk about those PSLW, there's respiratory protection required. So see, these regulations create these definitions or groups of definitions to tell you these are the requirements. This is what I want you to do. And so for PSLW, you got to have respiratory protection, minimum, half mask respirator with an N100, R100, or P100 filtered, just like the trigger tasks level 1, right? And then a full face air purifying respirator with N100, R100, or P100 filters, and half mask or full face replied air respirator operated in a continuous flow mode for trigger task level 2 as well. And powered air purifying respirators for certain high exposure tasks. So who does this assessment risk? Once you determine what the exposure is, then you're going to determine the respiratory protection. Full face SCBA operated in pressure demand and other positive pressure mode for trigger task level 3. Of course, PPE assessment needed, and full compliance with the respiratory protection standard is required for this types of activities. What types of activities? We go back to that same definition. Altering or disturbing material with anything that is 0.5% by weight or more, and those materials are included here in this slide for you. And then you're required to look into the respiratory protection needed for those particular altering or disturbing activities, right? Fit testing. I had a question regarding beards and facial hair and how popular they are. True. Mind you, one of my clients, a brewery, beards are the thing. just so many of the employees have beards, and jumping over the hurdle of having them be fit tested and wear a respirator has been a battle uphill. So the Centers for Disease Control have put out this nice infographic where they tell you, you know what, your respirator needs a sealing surface. So I need you clean shaven. But if you can't be clean shaven, take a look at some of the facial hair that may be allowed, because it does allow for a good seal against the skin of your face. And it can't be a actual what is it called, like a 5 o'clock shadow type of beard. It has to be clean shaven for the seal to occur. So they have names. I'm not too keen on the names, but you have this, the soul patch, that's a good one. The side whiskers, that's a good one too. The pencil type of facial hair is good, or it's just the mustache here. And then the lampshade, it's called a lampshade because it's very heavy facial hair on the lip and then towards the corners, but it's not going to there's no more facial hair besides that type of mustache, or the Zorro type, or the Zappa, the Walrus. Mine, okay, because these names are fabulous. The painter's brush, the chevron, the handlebar. So I use this infographic, especially when letting them know that facial hair is not allowed if they're going to be wearing a half mask elastomeric piece or an N100. Employer must provide protective clothing. So more on the PSLW, you have to have those. You have to determine coveralls needed. Lead dust can settle in the hair. So that's why you see the full hoodies, and the body coverage is full body coverage. Head coverings, if once again, personal protective equipment, if you forget about lead, historically has always required that you do an assessment, right? That's Title 8, California Code of Regulations 3380. You have to do an assessment. And when you do an assessment, you ask, is the head exposed? Are the eyes exposed? Are the hands? You go body part per body part. And can you eliminate the hazard without the use of PPE? That's what an assessment requires. Same thing here, right? Is the head going to be exposed to the settlement of these dusts, right? Then head coverings, separate storage for work and street clothes, employer responsible for laundering, just like any other industry where you provide this pieces of equipment where they cannot take them home. You need to make sure that you launder them appropriately, and no take-home exposure allowed. The hygiene facilities and practices are dedicated clean changing areas. So for those that are exposed to lead, no one else can use those dedicated clean changing areas. Shower facilities when the actual level is exceeded, but shower facilities are not always feasible. So that's creating an issue, especially with construction guys. When is trigger tasks level 3, they're required. But there is a caveat there that says if there's really no way you can provide showers, and you just have to document why is not feasible. But for any and all triggered level 3 triggered tasks, the requirement for shower facilities is there. Anything below trigger level 1 and trigger level 2, it's hand washing facilities, and then you're required to train people. You got to wash your face and your hands. And it's interesting because it's a requirement. So policing it, making sure that people do that, will get some of you to start scratching your heads and thinking, how are we going to do that? Well, it's a little bit like what the water requirement, right? You're required to provide water that is cool and suitably clean. And so because it has to be potable water, and it has to be it has to be clean and fit for drinking, you cannot allow that they bring these individual containers that are filthy. So a random inspection may take care of that. Same thing here, hand washing facilities, and that they are actually washing their face and hands may trigger a random inspection of, or a random inspection, or just showing up surprise visit, making sure the workers are doing it. Separate lunch break areas, no eating, no drinking, or smoking in lead work areas, regulated areas, and mandatory. I just said that. I repeated it. Okay. Hazard communication is in the regulation, although hazard communication is a separate standard that says, hey, if you're exposing them to any chemical that is hazardous, talk to them about it, explain the safety data sheet, make sure there's warning signs at the entrances, and the warning signs or labels have to have this specific lead work area may damage fertility or the unborn child, causes damage to the central nervous system. Do not eat, drink, or smoke in this area. So, and then it talks about the types of engineering controls available, and then it goes into implementation timelines. So by drawing, what's important right now is that this is being enforced, right? And then you have those CCAL and PSLW protections for the, for example, lead battery acid manufacturing industry, and you have trigger tasks requirements. The only one that goes into 2026, I believe, is for sandblasting in the construction industry, where the PEL is 25 micrograms per cubic meter all the way until 2026. All right, guys, so we are good with this. Oh, one more thing. Like I say, 1 hour. I mean, it's 3 o'clock and there's so much to share. This is the one of the few programs, written programs, that has a requirement to be updated twice a year. So you have to put it in your schedules. You have to review your written compliance program twice a year. You have to document what changes did you make, why did you make those changes. Resources and support are listed in your slides. And that's it, guys. I am open to questions. Ha! It's 3 o'clock. And forgive me, sometimes I'm more paused in the presentations, but this was fast-paced, and I knew it was going to be because is a lengthy standard. And
Thank
so I
you so
appreciate your
much.
time. We're moving on to questions.
Thank you so much, Alba. That was so helpful. And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat, except for some people asking if we're going to email the slides. And yes, if you attended today, all of the folks who participated will receive a copy of the slides, as well as I'll be sending the survey there again. So if you haven't seen it already, I put it in the chat. The evaluation, that's where you could provide feedback as well as request continuing education hours, or the 1 hour for today's webinar. If you'd like any other information, feel free to respond to that email that I will send out. Thank you all so much, and happy Pi Day.
Thank you. And yes, I did try. It helps a lot, guys, when you send questions prior to, because I tried to answer them during the presentation. And so I appreciate that. I touched on some of the points that you guys brought up during your registration. That's really, really awesome that you do that you take the time to write down what you're interested in. So thank you. And thank you, Veronica, as well. Have a great weekend, everyone. And yes, forgive me for going super fast today, but we really needed to give you some tools that you can review and go back to and try and make sense of this very, very detailed new couple of regulations.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
All right, we'll see you next month. Don't forget, first Friday of the month, we're back to tackling a new topic.
Oh, we do have one question here in the Q&A. It says, do general maintenance workers in organizations fall under this standard?
Yes. And you're like, no, do not tell me this. Yes, if they're, because maintenance workers are usually going to be doing some sort of tasks that exposes them to lead. So yes. So then we go back to seeing okay, how do we tackle this? Graciela, all you have to do is go on and talk to your maintenance guys and say, okay, guys, I got this new two standards. Do you ever do these kinds of tasks? And give them the list from the actual trigger tasks and from the actual topic that we discussed today. Under the general industry, you have the PSLW and you have the CCAL. So for any organization where maintenance guys are actually doing any maintenance work, if they do any of those tasks and say, yeah, you know what, sometimes we do this and I have to, they call me up to change a window or to do this or that, and it's an older building, and I find myself sometimes scraping, or the structure is not in very good condition because building A, you know, historically has been half always needing some sort of upgrade or maintenance. Okay, then, you know, they're scraping paint, what are they doing? So it will be something that you want to look into depending on the task they're doing. Start there. Ask the questions. Are you doing any of these tasks? Start right there. I hope that answered that question. Not a problem. You're welcome. I'm so grateful that you guys take the time to be here. And again, if there are no more questions, really, truly have a fantastic weekend. And if I don't know the answer to your question, we will find the answer for you. So thanks again. Oh, I have a lot of awesome people saying thank you and just making great comments here. I appreciate it. Thank
Thank
you.
you all so much. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now.
Thank you.